Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, welcome. Good afternoon, welcome. Okay, well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for joining this debate, which is hosted by the Elcano Royal Institute, coming to you live from Madrid. As you all know, we are extremely fortunate to have three excellent speakers for this afternoon's session. And we're going to be exploring the impact of the pandemic generated by the COVID-19 virus and on the disinformation or misinformation campaigns that have been generated in China and Russia, and which are having a very significant impact in some parts of Europe, the United States, and further afield. And to discuss this, what I hope and I'm sure will be a fascinating topic, we have three excellent speakers with us this afternoon. The first speaker will be Mira Milosevich, who is a senior analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank Mira for having put this session together. Thank you very much. Our second speaker will be Ivana Karásková, who is the China Research Fellow and also a project coordinator at the Association for International Affairs in Prague in the Czech Republic. Thank you very much for joining us. And last but by no means least, we have our good friend and colleague, Alina, who is President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Affairs in Washington, DC. Thank you very much, Alina, for joining us. I've asked each of our speakers to talk for about 8 minutes. And on this occasion, unlike some other earlier occasions, I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for a debate afterwards. Now, let me just kick off with a few very general observations, which I hope that some of you will feel free to pick up on. The first has to do with the title of our talk, of our debate today, the whole idea of disinformation or misinformation. And I was hoping that some of you might shed some conceptual light on this topic. How do we define misinformation, which I understand we can exchange freely with the term, I think they're both synonymous, effectively, misinformation and disinformation, but also how do they relate to the concept of propaganda, a much more traditional, long-standing concept in historical and political science literature. So what exactly do we mean when we're talking about misinformation and disinformation? The second point I'd like to make is that pandemics are a very curious phenomenon in themselves. When we think about pandemics as national security threats, that is, by comparison with other more conventional national security threats. And of course, if we look back at history, it's interesting that pandemics have always been very fertile ground for conspiracy theories of every kind. You know, if we go back to the Black Death in Europe in the medieval period, we immediately find a very interesting literature about how this generated anti-Semitic hysteria in many parts of Europe, for example. So I think pandemics are a specific kind of phenomenon, not least perhaps because they are difficult to understand even in scientific and medical terms. And this therefore leads to a great deal of ignorance and confusion, as well as ill-intentioned disinformation or misinformation. So I think we should also try and be conceptually clear about how much of the information that's currently out there, particularly of course in social media, is a reflection of this, of the confusion arising from this ignorance, and even from a legitimate scientific, academic, medical debate, and how much of it is actually the result of if you like, policy options which have been taken at the highest level in certain governments. Okay, so perhaps if you will bear with me, I think it would be interesting if we could shed a little bit of light on those concepts. When we advertised that we were holding this event, some people through social media in particular questioned the fact that we weren't including the United States and the United States administration as a possible source of this misinformation and disinformation. And of course, anyone who's listened to Donald Trump recently for more than half an hour will probably have strong views on this. And I'm sure that Alina Polyakova in particular, being based in Washington, has very strong and also very enlightening things to say about this. So what I want to stress is that, you know, there are no taboos in this debate. We are well aware of the fact that many European and certainly North America and the government of the United States, the US administration have also behaved in ways which perhaps left something to be desired in terms of their transparency and their accountability. Okay, so I just want to stress to our audience that there are no taboos here. We are not in the business of China or Russia bashing. We are in the business of trying to shed some light on these very, very complex issues that are going to be with us for many years to come. And without further ado, let me hand over to Mira Milosevich. Again, Mira, thank you very much for having put this together and for having convinced arm-twisted your colleagues to join us. Thank you, Mira. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon for everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will try very quick to put clear the concepts. I think that propaganda is information of misleading nature used to promote a political metrical of the high. It is dissemination of false news motivated by a political strategy and an intention to confuse and disorientate the adversary. In this sense, I will use the meaning of this concept. And I will focus on the Russian disinformation campaigns in the European Union, but before it, I would like just to make a few comments. The first one is why we are talking about the disinformation campaign specific to China and Russia. As Charles said, we don't have any specific business. We try just to put a little bit more light about these issues. First of all, because according to the data of the EU Disinfo versus Disinfo, an internal report of the European Commission, as well as the East Stratcom team of the European External Action Service, China and Russia are taking advantage of the context of this crisis in the absence, of course, of the leadership of the United States. And in this context, they attempt to shape the international narratives about pandemic to their advantage. The second reason is that we have a long experience with Russian disinformation. Russia invented this concept almost a century ago. Even we can that Russians' recent disinformation campaigns dates back to 2008. There are links to the Georgian War in 2008. And also we saw it regarding conflict in Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, elections in the United States, European parliamentary elections, Brexit, illegal referendum in Catalonia, and so on. So there is an ecosystem composed by the media financed by Kremlin, as RT, Sputnik, Peri Canal, RU Baltic, Point.ru, also sites registered outside Russia, but devoted mainly to Russian topics and with the openly pro-Kremlin agenda. So all of them, together with social networks like Facebook and Twitter, were and are the vehicles of spreading disinformation about the European Union, NATO, and the United States. The main objective of mentioned campaigns were to weaken the transatlantic relationship, foster division among allies, and challenge credibility of democratic institutions. What I want to say with this is, and to make a simple logical point, COVID-19 cannot explain today what was unleashed yesterday. What I want to say that the disinformation as one instrument of hybrid war, which Russia used to use in recent times in the context in the European Union, United States, and regarding NATO. And third, the reason why we are talking about Chinese and Russian disinformation is that China is learning very quickly about Russian disinformation tactics, and both countries, even they have very different objectives, have made combination of public relations propaganda or diplomacy of protective masks and campaign of disinformation. We have a new combinacja. We have a new combination of disinformation campaigns and propaganda. Regarding specifically Russian disinformation in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the very first case of disinformation on the current pandemic was a story from Sputnik, claiming that the strange new virus in China was probably made in NATO labs, and also that the US created the COVID-19 as a weapon against China and its economy. That was the very first narrative. Regarding the narratives targeting the European Union, there are the two main narratives. One is that the European Union is to deal with the pandemic. The Union is about to collapse together with the border-free Schengen area, and also that the European Union is selfish and betrayed in combination with propaganda about Italy. I will talk about it. And also, for example, in the case of Ukraine, they used to talk about that. Of course, Ukraine is the failed state. It's old narrative, but in this new context is that Ukraine was abandoned by its European allies. There are two main narratives about the European Union. The objectives of these narratives are, first of all, to fuel distrust in the ability of democratic institutions to deliver effective response to the pandemic, and also to challenge the credibility of the European Union and its partners. I think that behind of all of it is belief that weakening democracy can accelerate the decline of Western influence and advance Russians and Chinese geopolitical goals. I think also that here is important to highlight two things. The first one is that the Russian media have changed tactics in relation to previous campaigns of disinformation, as those related, for example, to the war in Iran. In the context of pandemic, more frequently is the case that these media are not the initial source of the fake news and these narratives, but that the Russian media just amplified the theories coming from China, Iran, or even the far right of the United States. And second point, which I want to highlight, is that also that there are signs that the disinformation campaigns are not coordinated by the Kremlin. That is, that there is no Russian government strategy behind it, but the media that are part of the previous created ecosystem by Kremlin have adapted their narratives to the context of the pandemic. In this sense, I think that it is important to highlight that not always the Kremlin is behind all disinformation campaigns, but previously created ecosystem just going on and just work. It is clear that the Kremlin has a strategy in case of propaganda. I have just two examples. One is the confusing reporting on Russia sending medical supplies to the United States, and about arrival of Russian military equipment to Italy scored the propaganda victory for Russia. In the case of the United States, the Kremlin achieved to introduce the products of the company under the US sanctions. And in the case of Italy, the message is just Russia is helping Italy and the EU is not. That is a clear attack to the European Union. Maybe I can later talk about the impact of these narratives, but I would like to finish with what we should do with all of it. It is clear that EU as well as NATO have already taken actions to contain disinformation and propaganda narratives. What remains to be done, and on which the future of the transatlantic relationship depends, is that the both sides of the Atlantic have to unite around common democratic values and not allow two authoritarian states to emerge from the pandemic crisis as the successful paradigm on their management. I think that that is all about these narratives and all importance of this, why we have to contain this kind of narratives. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mira. I apologize, we've had a bit of trouble with the sound occasionally, but I think on the whole, your ideas came through loud and clear. And I perhaps would like to dwell on two things you mentioned, which a lot of analysts have detected. First of all, there seems to be a convergence between China and Russia, which hadn't really happened before. In other words, the Chinese or some Chinese institutions, again, we have to be very specific about the statements we're making, but some Chinese media outlets and institutions seem to be imitating certain practices which were well established in the Russian context. So there seems to have been basically a convergence of both the content and also the tactics. And this, I think, in itself is very interesting. You also mentioned the point that there is a Russian ecosystem which has been there for a number of years and which is activated every time that others are in trouble, to put it very bluntly, if you like. And of course, we in the European Union give Russia plenty of opportunities to activate that ecosystem, given our internal difficulties over the last few years. So perhaps we can go back to these two ideas in the course of the debate. Let me now hand over to Ivana, who I believe is going to talk to us essentially about her region of Europe. In other words, how the Chinese, again, have been unusually active in Central Eastern Europe. The floor is yours. Thank you, Ivana. You have to activate your microphone.
Thank you, Charles. I have a very, very strange echo, and also my Zoom is freezing, so hopefully it will go through. Well, I absolutely agree with Mila, who said that China is on a learning curve. That's true that China, in comparison to Russia, is a relative newcomer to the region of Central and Eastern Europe. It uses a mixture of public diplomacy, propaganda, and recently also disinformation. And until very recently, China's style was very defensive. It tried to rewrite the discourse towards positive news about China and utilize the praise from foreigners who praised CCP and then transfer this praise from the local countries towards the Chinese audience back home. So once again, for reinforcing the image that CCP is doing a marvelous job, that it's fully in control of everything. But this started to change. So the Chinese style started to be much more offensive than it used to be in previous times. And perhaps I might dissect it into three different stages in terms of time frame. the modus operandi before 2019, the modus operandi during 2019, and also where we are right now. So attempts to rewrite China's narrative in Central and Eastern Europe could be traced as far as back to 2015, actually, when Chinese company CEFC, who then turned out to be a Ponzi scheme, invested into Czech media, and it acquired a stake in one of the Czech TV stations. And coincidentally, in 2017, we ran an audit through our project Influence of or media analysis of how China were portrayed in different media in Central and Eastern Europe. And we found out that from the moment when CEFC acquired a stake, minority share, actually in those Czech media outlets, the narrative on China changed significantly. It actually, all the notions which were either negative or neutral about China disappeared. The only things which stayed were positive about China. So it led us into a conclusion that when China invests into media, no matter how big the share is, actually the narrative changes dramatically. And that led us once again to advocating for investment screening mechanisms in European Union to include media and to see them as strategic assets. We also realized that China uses the same avenues as Russian influence. So it uses the alternative media outlets. Where we found pro-Russian narratives, we also started to look for pro-Chinese narratives, and we found them. And we also realized that China is using the same agenda setters, that people who were vocally pro-Russian tend also to be vocally pro-Chinese. Well, there might be different kind of explanations. One of them could be that those agenda setters were naturally anti-West. The other one could suggest some kind of cooperation or collaboration between the Chinese side and the Russian side. So we started to look for traces of collaboration, and there were scarce instances. The only one we can really put our finger on is a case in Bulgaria where we know that China Today and Russia Today and China Daily, they share offices, they share publisher, and they share editors. And this so far is the biggest kind of example of how these two cooperate. In 2019, it was a game changer because we have seen the protests in Hong Kong, and that activated and increased Chinese activity and attempts to rewrite the narrative. So we look at media in Central and Eastern Europe, and to our surprise, we found an increased activity of Chinese ambassadors who started to approach media, offering them ambassadorial op-eds. We analyzed the op-eds, and we figure out that the op-eds, despite they are in different languages, in Central and Eastern European languages, they contain identical sentences, identical phrases. And we found out in 6 different languages in EU member states. And we also found this in outlets in Montenegro, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in North Macedonia. So this once again shows a kind of coordinated effort to rewrite the narrative. There are also incidents of paid supplements which are placed into local media and which are posing as a normal production of the media. So it's usually written by local journalists, and it's sometimes obscurely labeled as theme and commercial supplement without actually disclosing who is paying for those supplements. And those supplements, I think it's not so surprising, are only positive about China again. We also seen an increased activity of China Radio International, which is broadcasting in a number of languages, in English, German, Italian, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and so on. But it also broadcasts and runs internet sites in 7 other EU member state languages: Bulgarian, Croatian, Czech, Greek, Hungarian, Polish, Romanian, and so on. And also the activities on social media, especially on those which are blocked normally in China, meaning Facebook and Twitter. The activity also has risen significantly. But this was sort of a learning curve, riding from trying to project positive energy first, and then trying to rewrite the narrative. But what we have seen this year with COVID-19 was even intensifying of all those accounts which were previously established and establishing of new accounts. So the Chinese embassy, for example, in Czech Republic started to tweet much more, started to put information on Facebook, started to place advertisements on its blog posts and so on. And Chinese Radio International started to actually pay, increase the number of followers first, and then to pay for content. So we discovered that Chinese Radio International, which has a website or Facebook site in Czech language, actually has 800,000 followers. 850, I think, up to date, 850,000 followers. We are talking about a country of 10 million. So effectively thinking about 1/10 of the whole population following CRI, it doesn't seem very plausible. So by looking at the accounts who are following CRI in Czech language, number of those accounts are obviously fake accounts, or accounts which couldn't belong to any Czech speaker because their names are, for example, in Arabic. There was also an attempt to pay for the content. So Chinese Radio International reached out to Czech and Slovak students of Chinese language, offering them €20 if they shoot a video praising China for its fight against COVID-19. And it was scripted. There were phrases which had to be included to all those videos to actually get the money back. So these are interesting examples of how China is mobilizing the accounts it already has, how it's learning from the Russian playbook. But these attempts could be still attributed to public diplomacy or propaganda. Cases of downright disinformation are not so numerous. In 2019, we found one very shy example or testing of a fake video, which was produced by Chinese, and it was the video of Czech President Milosevich in Beijing, who very kindly acted towards some elderly lady and so on. It was very soon discovered that this video was fake. It was sent to Czech media outlets probably for testing how they would react, who will pick it up, who will run it, how the whole process of verification will be done and so on. So this was one very shy example. The other example of disinformation is, of course, this narrative on COVID-19 being produced in the US. This information has been put on China Radio International Facebook page in Czech language. And it was then reproduced by Chinese embassy as well. And one latest attempt we found, and which was quite more successful because it made it to Czech media, was an attempt to persuade the public that if Huawei is excluded from 5G networks, then it would be much more costly for the Czech state to go through 5G. So it made it actually into Czech media until to the point where the journalists discovered that the analysis, which is quoted with numbers, was actually produced in cooperation with Huawei itself. So I would like to finish here and by concluding that China is indeed on a learning curve, that it has been still more on the side of public diplomacy / propaganda than it was on disinformation campaign sites, but this might change very quickly, and I actually expect this to change because China has been following Russian disinformation campaigns for a number of years. We know that now they piggybacked on the same media outlets and the same alternative outlets and even use the same agenda setters. So I would like to finish here and by
excellent
that China is indeed on a learning curve.
Sorry, thank you for that. And thank you for being so precise in trying to distinguish, as I was encouraging you to do at the beginning, between what we might term legitimate forms of public diplomacy and propaganda, which of course, democratic states, accountable states and accountable governments also, I think, legitimately engage in, and something completely different, which is disinformation. And I didn't mention at the beginning, but I think it's very important that obviously we wouldn't be talking about this if it weren't for the role of social media. Twitter informs us that they have 12 million, they've acquired 12 million new users in the last 3 months, in the first 3 months of 2020. And there are similar statistics from Facebook and Instagram. So obviously, given confinement, people are at home, they have more spare time. There's obviously, there are a lot of people who are very worried about what's going on out there, quite justifiably so, of course. And this is therefore increasing the likelihood, the potential for this kind of disinformation to reach its targets. Mira earlier on the telephone was reminding me of a Pew Research Center report, or rather poll, which suggests that 3 out of every 10 Americans believe that COVID-19 was produced in a laboratory, and apparently a very similar proportion of Spaniards have come to that conclusion as well. So this is obviously beginning to affect very significant proportions of our population. Okay, well, thank you. So Alina, over to you. And I will remove.
Well, thank you, Charles, and thank you, Elcano, for organizing this interesting conversation. You know, at CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis that I had, we've also been focusing on this issue of trying to understand the so-called infodemic that we find ourselves in when it comes to state-sponsored information influence operations. And I think there's been a lot of interest in this issue, particularly because this really is the first time around COVID-19 that we're seeing these kinds of information influence operations around a public health issue that is coming from foreign state actors. We've seen this already in around public health, specifically in India, for example, in other countries, but this is the first time that we're seeing this happen in Western European countries, the United States, and more globally. So I think that's just an important point, that there's a lot of differences between where we are now, what we're seeing today versus where we have been for the last few years, when of course the focus has been much more on election influence and interference following 2016. So I think it's just important to note that we're not talking about elections now. And this goes to the point that these kinds of influence operations in the information space have never been just about influencing the outcomes of elections. They've also always had, at least from the Russian side, a much broader strategic intent to try to influence public debate, narrative, as Mira was also saying, to undermine the idea that democracies are successful economically, politically, in all kinds of ways. And we're seeing those similar narratives today, but of course they're not happening around elections. And we've seen similar disinformation campaigns from Russia. I would just point back to the attempted assassination of Skripal and his daughter in the UK, where of course the UK government was confronted with a barrage of this fire hose of falsehood, as some of our colleagues call it, from the Russian side, to try to muddy the truth, try to muddy the objective reality of what had actually occurred, with countless dozens and dozens of conspiracy theories, misleading stories, and disinformation campaigns. So there are some things about our current moment that are not unique, but that stem from a longer history and a longer set of strategic tactics that we've seen deployed in other contexts around elections, around other global events. And for Russia, that goes back to the Soviet period, as Mira said. But there are also a few areas where I think we find ourselves in a very unique moment. And I want to highlight some of those, as my colleagues already started to do as well. And I have to admit, both Mira and Ivana have already made a couple of the points that I was going to make. So on the one hand, I think it's nice that we're on the same page. On the other hand, I'll just try to add a little bit more nuance to what they already put on the table. So Charles, to go to your opening question as to how do we define what are the concepts we're working with, I think that, to my mind, the difference between disinformation, misinformation focuses on intent. So misinformation or the spread or sharing by individuals of misleading or even false information does not necessarily have to be intentional. Individuals share information that they may not know is false on their social media elsewhere, and that may not be intentionally malicious in any way. Disinformation has an intentional malicious component to it. There is a strategy there that is far beyond a narrow mistake or a correction of some kind or incorrect statement of fact. It is the intentional spread of misleading information to achieve a certain goal. But I also think we have used the term so much that it has become quite muddied. And the term I prefer to use, and I think a lot of researchers are moving towards this direction, is information influence operations, because that's really what we're talking about. We're really talking about specific actors trying to manipulate information to serve a specific strategic objective. And that's the term I'll try to use most of my comments today. Now, to focus on what's really different about the current moment than what we've seen before. I mean, what the Russians have been doing around COVID-19, as Mira eloquently said, has not been anything new. It's the same kind of tactics, it's the same strategy, it's the same actors that we've seen be active in the US in 2016, in Ukraine, around Skripal, all kinds of different events. Also the French elections, of course, around the situation with Catalonia in Spain. It's the same kinds of actors over and over, basically following the same tactic of a combination of overt influence operations stemming from state-sponsored media like RT and others, which are sometimes true and sometimes misleading, and sometimes they're conspiracy theories. They're then buttressed by a digital campaign that is often carried out through these kind of false entities, trolls, bots, these kinds of inauthentic accounts. What has been new, as Ivana has said, has been the Chinese actions around COVID. For a long time, there's been the question of when will the Chinese start to turn outward, not just in terms of their soft power and public diplomacy, which of course they've been doing for a very long time, but really when were they going to turn their very quite massive capacities and capabilities, certainly much grander than what the Russians have. Just looking at the inequity between the two countries on the financial front, there's absolutely no competition between what the Russians can do just in terms of resources versus what the Chinese can do. Just as a reminder, the Russian economy, just as a little test case, it's about 2%. It's actually about the size of Spain's for a country that's much larger than Spain, whereas the Chinese economy is now competing for size and domination with the US economy, about 20 to 25% of global GDP. So there's a huge rift between the two countries. And so I think just because of that, it's almost difficult to compare the two. But what's been interesting about China is, of course, we've seen the Chinese be involved in Taiwan and in Hong Kong, where they've attempted to shift the narrative towards a more favorable narrative towards China, but also through just broad censorship of information, which is something the Russians are not able to do and not capable of doing as well. But they haven't launched or deployed these capabilities externally in the way the Russians have. So for a long time, we said, okay, the Russians, their information influence operations are inherently disruptive, and they're meant to spread a sort of undermining negative message most of the time. And they have that sort of intent to exploit vulnerabilities, to widen social divisions, to increase polarizations in our society, to try to destabilize and sow chaos in our societies. And what the Chinese have been doing, this was the narrative, I think, before COVID-19, has been more like propaganda, trying to present a positive message of China, a positive vision of China. And it hasn't been negative or disruptive or trying to undermine Western institutions. And I think that has changed now. I think now we've seen the Chinese, as Ivana and Mira said, learn significantly from the Russians in what they're able to do. And I think we, for a long time, experienced or interpreted what the Chinese have been doing by exactly what Ivana described. It's not just a Central Eastern Europe or Balkan issue, The Chinese have been very active, of course, in Africa and other parts of the world with similar kinds of tactics of acquiring media organizations. Then the narrative that those organizations produce switches. And we need a lot more research in this space. But I think the kind of process that Ivana described for the regions that she has studied, it has been repeated all over the world by the Chinese. And we've seen this, as relatively benign, because the Chinese weren't trying to push a disruptive, chaotic message. They weren't trying to undermine societies. They were trying to push forward, a more positive or a very still neutral message of China. But now we see that these are not actually benign activities, because now we're in a situation where I think we understand that over time, this kind of long-term strategy, which is very different from the Russian more short-term strategy, has much more corrosive long-term effects, meaning that now we're in a situation where these kinds of activities by the Chinese are threatening freedom of speech, especially in countries where you don't have a very well-developed independent media space or civil society space, where acquiring or shifting the narrative through a few relatively small investments can have a huge impact on the kinds of narratives you see in mainstream discourse. And so over time, I think we have to understand that what we've seen from China in these kinds of investments, in the desire to push for a more positive message, is not just soft power. It's not just public diplomacy. There is an intent behind it to, over time, basically censor information, not just within its own borders, or let's say in Taiwan and Hong Kong and Tibet, I would add to that, but across the globe. And I think the COVID-19 has really exposed the depth and breadth of these kinds of activities by China on a global level. Just a couple of quick other points, and then I would love to get to audience questions. The other point I would make is that, we do have to think a little bit more about the role of social media platforms, as you said, Charles. And I think the positive and effect that we've seen during COVID-19 is that the platforms have invested quite a bit of resources now into being able to identify that covert side of information influence operations. So again, we distinguish between overt, which we know are state-sponsored, explicitly state-sponsored media organizations like RT and others. And then there's the covert side, which happens in social media platforms. And the platforms have called this coordinated inauthentic behavior, or they call it CIB for short now. And they've become much better at identifying these networks of inauthentic accounts, so accounts pretending to be something that they're not, and then being used to spread all kinds of misleading or misleading information or conspiracy theories. And they have now, over time, built the capacity to take those accounts down, and they are working closely together. So Twitter or Facebook, YouTube are working more closely together to and Instagram as well, to identify all of these accounts and take them down and get rid of them. Now, that part of the problem, I think, has been brought under greater control. So certainly we still don't know the scope of it. So when Facebook or Twitter take down 100 accounts, 1,000 accounts, we don't know, is that 2% of the problem? Is that 50% of the problem? So we still don't have a lot of clarity or transparency into how companies make their decisions. But certainly around COVID, they've been working very, very closely with EU institutions, especially having regular meetings to understand where they can do better in a public health issue. Because I think in this case, it goes far beyond politics. There's a real public health component here. Obviously, there's life and death involved. And I think the platforms have actually done a lot more than they have in the past to be able to confront this problem. And then lastly, I think going forward, the big questions remain to me, and I would love to talk about this more in the Q&A, is to not just looking at how Russia and China and other state actors potentially carry out influence operations in democracies, but what are their narratives about each other? And I think that's very interesting, because what we see from the Russians, at least in tracking some of the information that they've been putting out in Russian language and also foreign language media is a very positive view of China. And the Chinese, I don't know exactly, but because I don't read Mandarin, but to what extent that has also been the case with China towards Russia. So in a way, to what extent are they buttressing and supporting each other's efforts or not, I think is a really interesting question as we move forward in this crisis. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about the US if there are questions about that, with the caveat that I'm not an expert in US politics, but since I'm in DC, I feel it's my responsibility to deliver a little bit insight to the extent that I can on that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alina. Thank you in particular for that conceptual clarity and for raising some very interesting questions about the subtleties between the way in which some of these states operated in the past and how they're operating today. I'd like to invite Mario Esteban into our conversation. Mario Esteban is our senior analyst for China. And he wanted me to mention, and I'm very happy to do so, that he, together with some other European colleagues at the European think tank Network on China, which is an organization that looks at the bilateral relationships between EU member states and China, have produced a report which will be published in late April. And he has a contribution on Spain in that volume. So he has just joined us now. Good afternoon, Mario. So if you could just tell us a little bit, Mario, I know you've been listening to this very interesting conversation. What is your perception of the way China has operated in the Spanish context? Of course, Spain, together with Italy, has been a particularly badly hit country in the European Union. And of course, a lot of these phenomena are very new to Spaniards. Spain never really felt that it was a participant in the Cold War, although obviously it was. And to some extent, I think Spaniards are very surprised that, the Russians or the Chinese might be interested in events here. But of course, we know that they are. So please, the floor is yours, Mario. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, I would like to mention, a little bit about the differences that we have seen in the report that you just mentioned, because the Chinese diplomats and the Chinese authorities, they are not operating the same way in different European countries. For example, in Italy, there have been quite a few fake news, about the Chinese aid and the reaction of the Italian population towards Chinese aid. For facing the coronavirus, there have been quite a few fake news, that were trying to overplay the positive reactions, of the Italian people towards the Chinese aid, and also in social media. It was mentioned before, for example, in Twitter, there Chinese, they have used fake accounts, they have used bots, to retweet, those fake news and create, the idea. There was huge popular support in Italy, towards China, but of course, it was not that popular. It was just fake, a support. But at the same time, in the case of Spain, we see that the Chinese diplomats and Chinese official accounts in Spain, they have a very low, they play a very low profile when it comes to this. We have check the Twitter account of the Chinese embassy in Spain and also of the Chinese consulate in Barcelona from February, to mid-April. We only could find one retweet, of a message that was clearly creating misinformation. Okay, it was a retweet of a statement by Hua Chunying, this is spokesperson of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that was creating doubts about the origin of the COVID, linking the coronavirus to the US, But at the same time, and I think this is interesting, the same accounts, they have presented quite a lot of information about joint initiative between China and Western countries, even the US, like in a positive way, like facing together, this coronavirus, so it's quite complex. I think that we don't, they create, quite a lot of different kind of messages, at the same time. And I think we should try to know a little bit more, about that, because we can see that the more, not just assertive, even aggressive narratives, they don't distribute those narratives most of the time through the official accounts, although sometimes a Chinese official media distributes very aggressive narratives sometimes. But we don't know yet enough about how how active there are Chinese actors behind fake accounts, behind bots, trying to create and distribute those more aggressive narratives. And I think that's one of the points we should look further into. Thank you, Charles.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mario. We've been receiving quite a lot of questions through our Twitter feed, and also you can still send questions to actividades@realcano.org, our email address. I have a couple of very interesting questions. One of them makes the point, okay, what we're saying is that basically because the pandemic originated in China, and this obviously put China on the defensive, that it was as a result of this that China has sort of crossed the line between traditional public diplomacy and propaganda techniques and disinformation. Now, this person wants to know whether you don't think this is perhaps actually counterproductive. In other words, China, and in fact, Mario's last remark would point in this direction as well. In a sense, these activities are contradictory. And in particular, of course, if it's the same outlets and the same institutions, and even sometimes the same individuals who engage both in, let's call it, legitimate exercises of public diplomacy and illegitimate forms of disinformation, then in a sense, they're shooting themselves in the foot, because in future, their public diplomacy efforts will be tarnished by definition. And so the question is it, do you agree that it was the severity of the pandemic and the extent to which China was being identified as the source of the pandemic, which effectively made them abandon their traditionally much more cautious approach to these issues and begin to follow Russia's example? Ivana, perhaps if I can address that to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. That's a fascinating and great question, actually, $1 million question. I think that one of the reasons is because what China did at the very beginning wasn't efficient enough to tackle the epidemics. So it created a lot of backlash by Chinese netizens, and it created a lot of distrust in Chinese society. So that was the starting point, I think, when China decided that they have to be much more offensive than they used to be, that they have to not only change the narrative abroad, but most importantly, change the narrative back home to see that China is not to be blamed for, that this is actually United States, NATO, whoever else should be blamed for Italy, for example, should be blamed for that. So I think that that is one of the factors, but some of the offensive cases but this is we still are talking about public diplomacy. One of the offensive cases came even early, before COVID-19. So the attempts to rewrite narratives were also much more aggressive than they used to be. And partially, I think it's because China saw that it may be working. And it was working for those who started it, like Zhao Liqian, the current spokesperson for Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who was very, very outspoken, who got into a Twitter clash with a number of people regarding the US treatment of African Americans and so on. So He set the tone, I think, and then he was promoted, and the other diplomats basically followed. So this is a new style of the new generation of diplomats who do that for their own promotion and who probably were even frustrated as well. So the motivations could be numerous. So frustration by not getting the message out by normal channels or by normal ways, wanting to be promoted again. So these could be all the factors. So I don't think we are going somehow back. That's this, I think we already passed the point of no return, or the Chinese diplomacy already passed that point. So we might see more offensive in terms of public diplomacy, in terms of propaganda, but also in terms of disinformation.
Thank you very much. Alina, your presence here has attracted a lot of interest among Trump lovers, among our followers. Basically, I'm not sure how to summarize a lot of the questions that we're getting. I suppose the drift is, isn't the Trump administration just as guilty of acts of disinformation or misinformation as the Chinese and Russian authorities? I suppose that's basically the question that people would like an answer to. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. I knew it was coming. I think there's a big difference. I think there is a big difference here between what's been happening in the United States. I mean, certainly there's been a lot of criticism about how the administration has handled the crisis. I'm not a public health expert, but it's all very much out there regarding the rapidity and reliability of testing early on, things of that nature. The administration didn't move quickly enough. I mean, these are all kinds of legitimate issues that we should be talking in our public debate and where we hold our politicians accountable. I think the big difference between what happens in authoritarian states like Russia and China is the fact that there's very little transparency about the real effects of this crisis. There are a lot of questions that continue to remain as to whether we can trust the kinds of numbers we saw coming from China, given the kind of censorship environment that we have in China right now. I think it's very difficult to trust those numbers. There's a lot of questions about the initial cover-up that happened in China and Wuhan by local officials, but also potentially by higher level officials that likely helped spread the virus more aggressively and more rapidly across the globe. Then, of course, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about the origins of the virus, et cetera, that I don't want to get into because that is part of the disinformation campaigns coming from all sides, I should say. But I think in Russia as well, Russia initially had very low numbers and there was a huge mystery. Why is every other country being affected and seeing very similar curves? But in Russia, we weren't seeing that at the beginning. Of course, now the Russians have been publishing more of their numbers. There's a lot of questions at the onset whether there was a spike, for example, in reported pneumonia cases in Russia, according to official figures in January, about a 40% spike compared to a similar month the year previous. Why was that happening when they had very, very low COVID cases? So there's a lot of questions about transparency in authoritarian states that we, and in a democracy, we can at least have more transparency because we have open media, we have freedom of speech, and we should be holding our governments accountable when they're not fulfilling certainly public health demands by the population and they're not acting swiftly enough to do so. But I think that is the huge difference. We are having a huge public debate in the United States. Obviously, this is an election year about the current response, whether it was effective or not. And there are positives and negatives on both sides of that debate. But the fact is that we're having a debate, period. That's not something that's happening in China. And the kind of social control we've seen in China that has been using technology as surveillance tools is also really, really worrisome. And I think it's going to have long-term consequences. So I think I would just, point to the fact that, yes, there's a huge amount, no question, that this administration could have done differently in hindsight, of course. I think we could probably say the same thing of some European countries as well. There's a huge amount that perhaps Italy or France or the UK could have done and should have done differently to mitigate the effects. But I think the reality is that the transparency of those mishaps is just not something we have in authoritarian states like China and Russia.
Let me give you, thank you very much. Let me give you a practical example of the difference between a state that practices this and one that doesn't. The Spanish government today, I think, has made public the fact that it has a suspiciously large number of followers who applaud it enthusiastically, applaud everything that the health ministry does. And most of the accounts have rather exotic foreign names and very few followers. So I think this is quite an interesting and rather original case where a government actually points out the fact that it doesn't really want that kind of company. I have a follow-up question, Alina, if I may, and I may encourage the others to jump in as well. The State Department recently apparently produced, although it hasn't publicly released, a report which now coins the term an axis of disinformation. The membership of which, of course, is China, Russia, and Iran. And of course, this is horribly reminiscent of another axis that we were all very familiar with. The question that I've been asked is this a clever move on the part of the State Department? Is this kind of battle of narratives really in the interests of the US? And this takes me back to a very interesting point you made, Alina, about how the different countries view each other, what the Chinese narratives about Russia are, what the Iranian narratives about Russia and China are. And I don't want to condone this notion of an axis of disinformation, but it may be interesting in future to see how the three states have to some extent backed each other up during this crisis.
So just to say, I mean, there have been reports of this State Department report, but I have not seen it myself. So I can't really comment on the specifics of the report and the phrasing that was used and for what reason. However, there has been reporting of this terminology of the axis of disinformation. I think the reality is that since 2016, the US government, especially the State Department, has funded through Congress a unit called the Global Engagement Center, which perhaps some have heard about, that is focused specifically on countering state-sponsored and non-state sponsored disinformation campaigns, particularly originating from the top threat vectors, which are Russia first, now China, obviously, and also Iran has been very active in this space as well. And I think there's been a stated desire, obviously since 2016, by the US government, certainly at State Department, certainly by Congress, to push back against these kinds of disinformation narratives. So I think we have to be part of this game, for better or for worse, but we have to be part of it in a very specific way, meaning that we should never be in a situation as a democracy, and this goes true for the United States or any democratic country, where we're involved in disinformation campaigns ourselves. We should push back with facts. We should push back with truth. We should push back with transparency, which complies with democratic values and principles. Again, have there been mishaps there? Perhaps, but I would say that I commend the US government for doing more in this space. Because if we go back to the Cold War, just very quickly, the US was very much leading the effort to counter Soviet era propaganda that would try to undermine US interests and Western interests across the globe. We weren't always successful. There were many stories, and I won't go into too many examples, that had profound consequences at US public diplomacy abroad, because they spread all kinds of misleading, false information about like the HIV virus being invented by the CIA in an army base in the United States, which is almost the same narrative we're hearing now on Corona. There's a lot of parallels here. So I think the reality is that we have to be, as democracies, pushing back against strategically intentional influence operations that are trying to sow chaos and undermine our societies, but we have to do it in the right way.
Thank you very much. I have two specific questions for Mario and Mira. Our Spanish viewers are wondering, what evidence do we have of Chinese and Russian involvement, state official involvement, in disinformation relating to Spain specifically? Mario has already mentioned that the embassies, the official outlets have maintained a very low profile. And perhaps I can also ask Ivana to, she has given us some specifics, but so for those of us who are, incredulous, if you like, and who believe that we are to some extent legitimizing an anti-Chinese and anti-Russian narrative, do we have any specific instances of Russian or Chinese official state involvement in disinformation, as opposed to initiatives that we might describe as acts of public diplomacy or propaganda more generally? Perhaps Mira can start.
No, just to say that there is no evidence that Spain is a specific target of the Russian disinformation, but also I have to say that, for example, the Spanish channel RT is the 12th most shared account on networks such as the Twitter and Facebook. So the information which Sputnik launched in Spanish, for example, is in the 12th most shared account. I think that is a significant information. But also, I think that doesn't mind that Spain is not specific target, because Spain is the member of the European Union and member of NATO. And I try to explain how the European Union and NATO was the clear target of Russian disinformation. In this sense, I think that Spain, Spanish government and Spanish people just have to show more solidarity with another member states.
Thank you very
Yeah,
Mario.
yeah, just one quick sentence, because in the case of China, this is even lower. As I said before, among tens and tens of tweets, there is only one, related with the COVID crisis that we can identify as misinformation. No, actually, no, it's not it's disinformation, because they were actually trying to create confusion about the origin of the virus, related with the US. And most of their covering of the crisis is very cooperative. It's quite positive. Also with Spain and with the allies of Spain, even including the US. Let's be clear. There's even some examples, positive about the US. But as Mira mentioned, there is a wider, framework, and in that regard, of course, the Chinese are being very critical with other countries, other allies of Spain.
I'm going to ask you all a final question, if I may, which has to do with how effective all of this is. We at Elcano recently published a poll which suggests that, although admittedly the field work was carried out in the very early stages of the pandemic, the poll suggests that Spanish public opinion hasn't really changed its attitude towards China as a result of the pandemic, either for better or for worse. In other words, public diplomacy, China's public diplomacy efforts do not seem to have succeeded if the aim was to stress Chinese solidarity in the face of alleged, let me stress, alleged EU incompetence. Ivana, what do you think the likely outcome of these campaigns is going to be in Central and Eastern Europe?
I'm not exactly sure if I got it directly, because I had 10 different people talking right now to my to my earplugs. But if I got it right, you were asking about effectivity of the Chinese operations. Is that correct? Well, I think it's too soon to actually say, because what we have seen is quite recent ones, so it's quite difficult to measure it too far and to measure an effect of that. I would be, though, doubtful about the real effectivity, because what we have seen is attempt to really influence the public through Chinese entities was very, I would say, fade or vague so far. When it started to be effective is when it's picked up by the local speakers. So once it's tweeted or used by the Chinese embassy, for example, with a clear attribution where the source is coming from, then people don't trust it, to put it in a very simple way. Once it's picked up by the local media, once it's started to be retweeted by the local actors with a good Czech language or with a good skills how to promote that, then we are getting into the trouble. So I would love to actually see a very good research on the effectivity which might be used on the Chinese disinformation and on propaganda. But so far, the only way probably how to measure it is through the change of the perception of the country through the polls. And Czech Republic has been constantly very, very skeptical about China, very negative. So far we haven't seen any change with all the attempts, including acquisition of media. We haven't seen any attempt to basically rewrite the sentiment or perception of the Czech, if I can talk about Czech Republic, which is the closest case I follow.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I can ask Alina to answer the same question. Let me tell you, by the way, that we've had about 800 followers in the course of the hour or so that we've been together. So thank you very much for making that possible. Alina, how effective? You've been a Russia watcher for many years, and of course this new development is interesting. We're not suggesting, of course, that Russia and China are working together, that we're not saying that they're coordinating their messages, but we're saying that de facto there has been a growing convergence during this pandemic, both in terms of the messaging and in terms of the rather heavy-handed tactics that have been used. I know the great American public is otherwise engaged in many ways, but moving on and looking ahead to the presidential election, for example. I know this is a lot to ask of you, but what are your predictions on this front? I mean, do you think that ultimately domestic issues are going to play such a prominent role for very good reasons, in fact, that they will drown out any kind of impact? Or do you think President Trump is actually going to be able to use a lot of these inputs that are coming from abroad in order to strengthen his message and perhaps ultimately even gain re-election in November? And forgive me for putting you on the spot like that, but you are our guru on American politics. And I think this will be my last question. Thank you.
Well, just to say that I completely agree with Ivana's comment that in terms of whether we're seeing convergence in strategy tactics, it's really too early to tell. It certainly seems to be the case, but we need much more analysis and research on this. I think there has been a big question that I've had about authoritarian learning more broadly when it comes to malign influence of all kinds, not just in the information space, because I think the information influence operations are just one part of a much broader toolkit in which authoritarian states especially are trying to compete and undermine democracies, and in particular the United States and the Transatlantic Alliance. I think going forward is going to be interesting to see to what extent the Russian playbook is being picked up by others as well. China has always been the big question mark. We've seen Iran use a very similar playbook, and now we see the Chinese doing it as well. So it kind of raises that big question mark, but too early to call with any conclusive evidence. Look, on the United States, I don't have a crystal ball. There's no question, obviously, that usually we would be at the peak of our presidential campaign right now. And because the crisis is drowned out, focus on anything else except the public health effects, we basically are in a strange position where, at the beginning of the crisis, we still had at least two candidates, Bernie Sanders and former Vice President Biden on the Democratic side. And then they had to completely stop campaigning, more or less, and switch it to virtual events. And it's hard to see how even by the fall, they're going to be able to hold rallies. And again, for Biden, who now has been endorsed by Bernie Sanders and all other former Democratic candidates, he will be the Democratic nominee. But it's hard to also tell how the inability to hold these big rallies, which have also been the big selling point, and the sort of the trademark of President Trump's earlier campaign and during his presidency, how that's going to affect his ability to mobilize his base. Will Twitter really be enough? I guess is the question. I think there's so many contingencies right now, and we're seeing, at least in terms of how the American public is responding to the government response to the crisis, we're seeing the same kind of polarization that we've seen in almost every other issue in our society. So we have a very strong base that the president mobilizes and commands quite effectively. And they have primarily been, I think, with the president, very supportive of his response. And then, of course, we have a large portion of Americans who, on the Democratic side, but also kind of in the center of it, who've been very critical of the federal government response and of this administration's response. But those divisions overlap almost perfectly with what we've seen in the past when it comes to any issue related to pro-Trump versus anti-Trump supporters and base. So right now, I think the chances of re-election are actually quite high because we haven't seen a lot of shift in the base. I don't know where the middle ground voters will go. I think a lot will depend on whether Biden is able to bring the Bernie Sanders, the more left, Elizabeth Warren constituency over to his side as well, and whether people are actually able to go to the polls. I mean, at the end of the day, what matters the most is who shows up on the day off to vote. And what we've seen so far in the primaries that have been held has been incredibly ironic. One of our states held a primary at the same time when the governor of that state had a stay-at-home order. I mean, this is the strange situation we find ourselves in. So I think right now there's too many contingencies, but I haven't seen a huge shift in the kind of core constituencies on both sides.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alina, and forgive me for putting you on the spot there. And what this shows, of course, is that we must very quickly, in the not too distant future, organize an event on the US specifically. So thank you very much, Ivana from Prague. Thank you so much for joining us. That was brilliant. Thank you, Mira, for organizing this and for your contributions. Thank you, Alina, for joining us. And thank you, Mario. I look forward to seeing you all in the not too distant future. And hopefully in person even, perish the thought. And thank you to all of you who've been listening to us, and forgive me for not having been able to take more of your questions. We will be trying to send some of those questions to our speakers as we did in a previous event. Obviously we won't be able to answer them all, but we really are very grateful to you for having taken the trouble to send in your thoughts. And thank you so much for tuning in this afternoon. Good afternoon, goodbye, and stay safe. Take care, everyone.